If you were simply a casual observer, it would be perfectly reasonable for you to assume that the sapling springing from the earth relies almost solely on the nutrients in the soil to supply its needs for growth, as it transforms into a majestic tree.
But really, it pulls most of what it needs for growth from the air.
The sun's light gives the plant the energy to convert CO2 into the heavy carbon and oxygen atoms that will make up the majority of its solid structure.
How strange that something so heavy is made almost entirely out of ale and water and sunlight.
And minerals from the soil.
Yes, and then when a tree falls, and we use it to create a fire, oxygen and carbon reunite and become CO2.
And just like when the sunlight lent the plant its energy to cause it to grow, when we burn the wood and logs, some of that originally invested solar energy is returned to us in the forms of heat and light.
Then the green plants and the ocean plants absorb the carbon dioxide and through photosynthesis expirates oxygen for us to breathe in, and the cycle continues.
So even the heaviest plant is practically created out of thin air.
A particularly clever trick effectuated by our sun innumerable times every second of every hour, with all of nature enthusiastically participating in the performance of their lives.
A little different than all the rest. I'm quite old-fashioned where I had sometimes played chess. And when I'm out, I'm looking for that vintage fling. But all complexions that I adore, so hard to find, they seem impossible to score. So I dream on to someday find that vintage love.
Stepping into the 1950s, America was fully abuzz with industry and innovation as the post-World War years brought an unprecedented increase in prosperity and economic stability, all of which was balanced tightly on the confident perceptions of the greatest generation as they looked into the future through rosy glasses tinted with the promise of peace and infinite possibilities. After all, the average Joe returning home from the theater of war could now afford a home and 3 squares thanks to the GI Bill. This confidence, bolstered by the exploding economic growth and prompted by soldiers returning to a changed country bright with opportunities, translated directly into a boom on the baby front of approximately 4 million little tykes born each year of the 1950s, only slowing down as the decade came screeching into the 60s, where it ended up midway with a breathtaking 77 million individuals embodying the formidable baby boomer generation. With the brightest of futures envisioned and technology roaring down the newly laid information highway at top speed, Walt Disney, whom incidentally we have to give props to for finding the exact spot on the Venn diagram where post-war prosperity and progeny intersected to build a rodent-based empire, released his True Life Adventure series filled with cutting-edge science and nature studies that gave all 77 million bouncing bundles of boomer joy a look at the intimate secret lives of the tiniest occupants of the planet, as well as animals and plants in every environment on Earth. And boy, was it a hit! Behind the scenes of the awe-inspiring films was an army of committed and brilliant innovators who took photography and creativity to levels not previously seen by the public. One of these individuals was a simple banker from Chicago with a penchant for plants and a fascination with photography that had begun in his high school classroom in the late 1920s. While John Nash Ott may have paid his bills working in the field of finance, his heart was in his hobby of developing elaborate time-lapse processes to photograph plants which he grew in his basement, illuminated only by a combination of fluorescent lights and a single window that let in a bit of daylight. So proficient was he in his little hobby that his work came to the attention of Walt Disney himself, who asked the banker turned cinematographer to provide a time-lapse video of a pumpkin from seed to finished gourd and a red apple from blossom to ripe fruit. John, understandably excited, accepted the challenge despite the difficulty of creating an enclosed greenhouse box of sorts, around part of the apple tree in his front yard, so that he could run his time-lapse photography setup for the months that it would take for the apples to reach maturity. If you are not aware, apple trees are not big fans of being dug up and moved into your mother's basement for observation, whether it's for the mouse himself or not. The contraption John created was climate-controlled and sported a 3-camera setup trained on particular apple blossoms. The tree was creatively secured through diligent rigging to prevent any movement despite storms, wind, or any inclement weather which occurred around the tree. Meanwhile, pumpkins are just not that particular and will grow almost anywhere there is the hint of soil, water, and light. Thus, the seeds were tucked into the soil down in John's basement, and the cameras were set to watch over their progress as the seeds sprouted. The maturing plants would give birth to perfect little gourds that, upon reaching their potential, would become pumpkins fit for a fairy godmother to use in her side hustle. Only, that's not how things went down. The pumpkin vine did grow beautifully, while the apple tree blossoms turned from flower to fruit right on time. The pumpkin vine broke out in cheerful staminate flowers. Only. This presented a bit of a problem because staminate flowers are male. There were 0 viable female or pistillate flowers to be found on this magical vine. Absent a fairy godmother to do a darn thing to remedy this unfortunate turn of events, John was forced to wait and start the process of pumpkin growing all over again the next year. Out in the front yard, the apples were growing brilliantly, free of disease and problems. Or so John thought. Until he noticed that the apples on the branches of the tree outside his special time-lapse greenhouse contraption had begun to blush, and the ones inside were still as green as the day they were born. This would never do, as Walt had his heart set on a deep red apple that would make Snow White's mouth water. The apples without cameras pointed at them quickly became glossy red, while the inside apples grew bigger but remained an unwanted chartreuse. Here it should be noted that watching apples and pumpkins develop from blossom or seed to fruit is up there in entertainment with watching paint dry or kettles boil. But John, who obviously had the patience of a saint, went back to the drawing board under the stress of having to produce a finished film for Disney's upcoming Secrets of Life, and having no idea what was preventing his plants from behaving properly in the presence of company. Throughout the winter, John discussed his apple failure with various experts and growers, and by the next year, the consensus was that different varieties of apples should be tried. John's greenhouse time-lapse studio boxes were constructed and attached to 2 different trees in an attempt to assure the success of the project. And then he waited and watched. Again, the apples on the outside of the boxes began to turn red, while the ones in the boxes continued to grow, but still remained green. After searching desperately for a reason that this disparity would be occurring yet again, John removed the glass panel from the top of the boxes and replaced them with a plastic panel that allowed the entire spectrum of sunlight through, particularly the shorter and ultraviolet waves. Within 2 days, the apples in the boxes were red, and after 2 years of nail-biting stress, the little apple film was completed in time to be included in Walt's movie. It also proved that apples could be kept from maturity by filtering certain wavelengths of light. Back in the basement, the second round of pumpkin growing was coming along splendidly. John had replaced the burnt-out fluorescents between growing seasons, and due to his normal lights being sold out, he installed the available daylight bulbs in their place. These bulbs were less popular amongst the general public because they gave off a slight bluish light, which made ladies' red lipstick take on an unattractive purple hue. The pumpkins, however, gave little thought to lipstick and thrived beneath the new lights, bursting out in male and female flowers. Only this time the male flowers turned brown and fell off before they could open, while the female pistillate flowers produced wildly. John recognized he was in a bit of a pickle, having located the perfect female pumpkin-producing flower, which was ready to open within 24 hours, he suspected, and him having no male flower with which to pollinate it. Because he had started early in the season, due to the temperature control he could exercise in his basement studio, there were no pumpkins blooming anywhere around him. And the mouse was waiting. After a desperate search, including calls to multiple state universities and horticulture groups, moving further and further south as he went, an ad was eventually run in the early edition of a Miami newspaper, and an appeal was put out over the radio for anyone who would be able to produce a male pumpkin flower for a lonely female pumpkin flower seeking her mate within 24 hours. Astonishingly, by 2 p.m, a woman called and offered her vine, which happened to have several male blossoms. But Providence wasn't done with this Cinderella story yet. The phone rang yet again while John was trying to figure out how to get the bachelor vine from Miami to his basement. On the other end, the vice president of Eastern Airlines, having heard of the female pumpkin's plight, arranged to transport the male vine on a nonstop flight from the steamy Florida coast to a chilly Chicago. A grateful and somewhat bemused John excitedly raced to meet the plane at the gate, surrounded by curious camera and newspapermen who suspected, due to all the commotion being made over the flight, that there was a celebrity on board. And they flatly refused to believe the fuss was all about a prince of pumpkins. The airline staff held the passengers while the celebrity gourd was escorted to John's waiting vehicle, where he was rushed back in time to fertilize the now open female pumpkin flower. From there, the rest of the journey from flower to fully ripened pumpkin was a piece of cake. Once again, almost 2 years in the making. In the end, Walt got his film in time to include it in his movie, Secrets of Life. And new information regarding the influence of certain wavelengths of the light spectrum on plants inspired John Nash Ott to dive deeper into the study of light, to find out just how much influence light has on plants, animals, and humans anyway. It turns out it affects everything, right down to our subatomic nature. In the little house where the pixies are currently encouraging their plants to keep calm and carry on, beneath the brutal scowl of the southeastern summer sun, the leafy folk in the potager are protesting both the oppressive humidity and all 5,700 kelvins of the sun's energy as it skips across the garden at midday. So disgruntled is the leafy mob of protesters in the potager that we suspect that if we left the back door ajar for even a moment, we might turn around and find our living room suddenly overflowing with desperate plant refugees who simply do not feel like doing the work of photosynthesis today. They have informed us, in no uncertain terms, that they prefer the gentle chronobiological or timekeeping effects and pinkish hues of the early morning and evening when the sun's light, heavy with red wavelengths, transfers energy in a considerably more pleasant manner. While the plants do normally crave sunlight, and particularly the blue and red spectrum of the sun's light, they prefer it not come in sustained temperatures reminiscent of a 90s McDonald's coffee pre-lawsuit. And that's fair. While the little deers are inarguably brilliant at converting sunlight to chemical energy, they prefer to do so minus the stress of solar energy overloading the system entirely. Their complex biological system of chloroplasts are organelles within the cells of the plants, which generate metabolic energy, similar to mitochondria in the human cell. Through an endothermic reaction known as photosynthesis, all plants and algae, as well as some bacteria, absorb the energy from the sun and convert water, carbon dioxide, and minerals into oxygen, glucose, and organic matter. This process begins when even a single photon or packet of light energy hits the water stored within the plant's cells. The reaction is sparked to life, and a chlorophyll pigment molecule eagerly absorbs one wave at a time, causing a negatively charged electron within the chlorophyll to become so excited that it breaks free of its atom and hits the transport chain road, moving rapidly along this highway filled with other equally as excited electrons on their way to help create chemical energy from light energy in a carbon fixation reaction and stored in the form of ATP and NADPH that will ultimately drive the conversion of that carbon dioxide and water to carbohydrates for long-term energy storage. In this light-dependent reaction, chlorophyll is described as having donated an electron. But with all that goodwill going around, The chlorophyll pigment must now replace the first electron which was donated immediately if this giving mood is to continue. And continue it must, because until the electron is replaced, the chlorophyll molecule is oxidized and cannot perform any more work. Once again, the sun comes to the rescue as light photons proceed to split a single water molecule within the plant, resulting in 2 new electrons and the formation of stable subatomic particles, positively charged oxygen and negatively charged hydrogen ions or protons. These 2 newly free electrons can now be donated back to the chlorophyll molecules waiting for help due to being short their electrons, causing the newly rejuvenated pigment molecules to get back to work. Meanwhile, the oxygen ions will be released into the atmosphere, and the positively charged, highly excited hydrogen ions will desperately search for something negatively charged to combine with, resulting in an activation of an enzyme that is the catalyst for the formation of glucose, the carbohydrate stored and metabolized by the plant to fuel its cellular activities, including building and respiration. While the plant world's ability to almost magically make use of light energy gathered from thin air and turned into solid mass and nutrients is awesome, the plant also knows when enough is enough, and actively protects itself from accepting more energy than it can safely use. When protons are flowing in at a mad rate and building up in the hallways and nooks and crannies so that the enzymes simply cannot deal with them fast enough, the danger of damage to critical plant proteins creates an internal emergency for its molecular machinery, and a switch is quickly flipped within the plant, which then automatically rejects the excess energy. Chlorophyll seemingly transfers the extra energy from light harvesting complexes to nearby waiting molecules known as carotenoids, such as beta-carotene and lycopene, who shake the excess energy off through rapid vibration and release it as heat to avoid a plant catastrophe. Once this switch has been activated, there is a reluctance in the harried molecular system to reactivate absorption, as it waits to see if a cloud passing over plans on covering the sun long-term or if it's simply a momentary respite from the sun's intense energy. While the switch is thrown, the plant is not building new material, and thus, scientists eager to find a way to improve efficiency in the overall design of creation are attempting to figure out just how to overpower the flip switcher's reluctance to jump back into energy absorption mode before it's fully convinced no further damage will be incurred. If they are successful in their research, they hope to facilitate more energy gathering by the plant, which on the upside could assure more biomass for the use in fuels and food across the world. In the potager, however, we have thus far refrained from restraining the plant's natural defense mechanisms, as we can sympathize with our plant's reluctance to accept an overabundance of energy from the southeastern sun in the summer. And while we may not yet understand all the possible downstream consequences of interfering with the plant's defense mechanism, we can almost assuredly theorize that there is a high possibility that there will be some. Meanwhile, not all light waves are created equal as far as the plant kingdom is concerned. Thus, plants are also picky about which wavelengths of light energy they're willing to harvest. Chlorophyll, the most abundant pigment in plants, is found in the chloroplasts of plants and algae, where it absorbs energy only in the range between 430 and 662 nanometers. So, the blue and red parts of the light spectrum, which is where they generate, through the aforementioned process of photosynthesis, the oxygen that sustains all life on our planet and other organic molecules. And despite its green color, the wavelengths in the green part of the light spectrum are not easy for chlorophyll to absorb, so it reflects the majority of it back, giving the appearance of chlorophyll being green when viewed by our eyes, which handily have the photoreceptors designed to detect that color. Carotenoids are another essential pigment with a complex range of responsibilities, including acting as photoprotectors, antioxidants, color attractants, and precursors to plant hormones. These little fat-soluble powerhouses, aside from being energetic movers and shakers and free radical scavengers, also absorb visible light energy in the blue part of the spectrum efficiently, and reflect back yellows, oranges, and reds. And at the ultraviolet end of the spectrum of visible light, The waves of energy in appropriate amounts and balance with the infrared waves are critical for plant growth and production of essential oils that act as an endogenous sunblock, naturally protecting the plant from excess UV exposure, which damages the plant's DNA and proteins, all the while enhancing taste and smell in the fruit. With the sun at its highest point in the day, the light at the Earth's surface is made up of approximately 44% visible light, with only 3% being ultraviolet and the rest made up of infrared light. Light energy in all its various wavelengths is essential to the plant as it busily builds and transforms matter out of the barest ingredients. This was a fact that John Ott learned back in 1956, and which encouraged him to continue to experiment with the effects of the different lengths of visible light on his plants, eventually finding he could control with absolute certainty the development of both male and female flowers simply by what spectrum of light he used. Energized by his discoveries, he proceeded to purchase a microscope to continue his research, and this would allow him to create time-lapse microphotography. With the use of different colored filters for the lights, he could affect the behavior of the chloroplast in the cell of the plant, and proved that different chloroplasts have differing wavelength absorption bands, leading him to conclude after countless experiments that full-spectrum visible light is an essential element in the process of completing photosynthesis, as the metabolism of the plant was able to be changed depending upon which wavelengths of light energy were available to it. An interesting fact, by the way, that he also investigated and proved in rabbit retinas. Here again, he worked with colored lenses, and he found he could cause the metabolic activity within the pigment epithelial cell of the rabbit's eye to increase or decrease, and even cause death. At this point, Ott was absolutely convinced that the sun's light was actually an essential nutrient, and that full-spectrum visible light was orchestrating just about every mechanism of growth and development, right down to synchronizing the physiological and biological rhythms of the tiniest systems. In other words, unlike Carmen Sandiego, the plant can tell just where they are in time and on Earth by the Zeitgeber or time cues from the sun's light, which is constantly setting the circadian clock present within every cell. These light cues create an anticipation in the plant as dawn approaches to prepare for light energy to be absorbed, growth to be stimulated, and repair to be managed, as well as for flowers to open at the most likely time for pollinators to be present, and to prime defense mechanisms for excesses of light energy in the middle of the day until it is time to prepare for the wrap-up of absorption and then rest as darkness falls. Your leafy folk are keeping time with an extreme accuracy, using visible light from the sun to inform them, with every cell keeping careful time to assure the organism in which it exists remains in perfect sync with the environment it inhabits. An atomic clock, so to speak, which is the master coordinator of the entire molecular world. And while the sun's electromagnetic energy may create and influence everything on Earth, there is a dark side to light as well, so to speak. The electromagnetic spectrum is capped on both ends with significant energy that is invisible to the human eye, but not to our plants or our own molecular makeup. Gamma rays, X-rays, and the ultraviolets are on one end of this spectrum, with the infrared, microwaves, radio, and long-wave radio on the other. Visible light sits sandwiched in between these formidable energies. While we are often tempted to believe that what we can't see can't hurt us, this is almost never the reality, as John Ott discovered while experimenting with these invisible ranges of light. And what he and others have found may just change how you perceive what lies beyond the white light of the visible spectrum, in the yawning dark side of energy. We hope you will consider joining us for our next video as we continue to investigate the sun, light, energy, and just why we are having the daylight scared out of us. If you would like to be notified when we upload our next video, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell icon to turn on notifications. We appreciate you liking the video, commenting, and even sharing it, as it all helps us continue to grow. Thanks for being here. See you next time.
Concerning matter, we have all been wrong. What we have called matter is energy, whose vibrations have been so lowered as to be perceptible to the senses. There is no matter. Albert Einstein.